Okay, so it's time to start. Warmly welcome to this side event, Incentivizing Carbon Dioxide Removal, Long-Term Strategies, Cooperation and Policy Design. It's organized by Linköping University and Stockholm University, and the research projects behind this event is funded by the Swedish Energy Agency and the Swedish Research Council on Sustainable Development. My name is Gunilla Reischl. I'm head of program and senior research fellow at the Swedish Institute of International Affairs, and I will chair this session. And the Secretariat is broadcasting this event live and online, both on SB56 platform and publicly via the YouTube channel. And the focus of this event is the increased attention on carbon dioxide removal, CDR. Given the limited progress on achieving rapid cuts in global greenhouse gas emissions over the past several decades, CDR is now recognized as a critical component for achieving ambitious climate goals, like net zero economy by 2050, for instance. And the expectation that CDR will play a key role in the climate transition is gaining traction in policy. And we will talk about these issues today, and in this panel we'll portray the recent CDR policy developments and showcase research on options for incentivization. And I'm very delighted to present a very highly knowledgeable panel to discuss these topics. To the far right here, from my side, we have Alexandra Buylova from Stockholm University, who will discuss the role of carbon removal in the long-term climate strategies. And then we have, not here, but online, we have Oliver Geden from the German Institute of International and Security Affairs, who will talk about residual emissions and implied removal in climate strategies. Then after that, we have Lundberg from Research Institutes of Sweden, and Liv will address the issues of policy instrument and show policy options for incentivization. Then after that, we have Mathias Fridahl from Linköping University, and Mathias will talk about the issue of removal obligations and carbon border adjustments. And last but not least, we have Florian Claeys from the European Commission, who will present the developments in the European Union carbon removal policy and certification. And each of the panelists will have 10 minutes for the presentation, and I will show you a sign. I think I just show this when you have 1 minute left to wrap up. So we have plenty of time for Q&As later on. So Alexandra, would you like to start?
Okay, thank you, Gunilla. My name is Alexandra Buylova. I'm a researcher at Stockholm University, and the focus of my talk is on planning for carbon dioxide removal, later referred to as CDR in my talk, in long-term national climate strategies. It's important to consider this topic because a significant part of how growing climate ambitions and national pledges will be accomplished still remains unclear and unspecified. And as a part of this, growing numbers of national commitments to net zero by 2050 inevitably forces countries to consider CDR in order to compensate for residual emissions from hard-to-abate sectors or to compensate for overshoot in emissions later in the century. So in this presentation, I will highlight how whether and how carbon dioxide removal is planned for in national long-term climate strategies that countries submit to the UNFCCC as a part of the Paris Agreement. And it's particularly interesting to look at these strategies and how CDR is planned for in them in comparison, for instance, to nationally determined contributions, because planning for CDR still could be considered as a longer-term objective by many countries. So in this presentation is based on research published last year in Frontiers Climate, and they did an overview of 25 strategies submitted to the UNFCCC. Since then, 25 more countries submitted their documents, and countries can upload and develop their strategies on an ongoing basis. So that's something to keep in mind. So in our analysis, we find that countries have pledged to achieve net zero or close to net zero targets, and that they plan on CDR, to rely on CDR to get there. However, none of the documents specify concrete CDR targets, and planning for CDR is very vague and lacking in detail. So there are 3 ways that we identify that CDR is planned for in the strategies. Some countries refer to CDR in non-specific qualitative terms as a possibility to be explored, or make statements about the general importance of CDR. Some countries state quantitative potential or projections for of the amount of carbon removal that is possible in their respective countries. And some uncertainty is minimized in a few strategies that state specific emission reduction targets from which CDR targets could be approximated if net zero is the final objective. So lack of concrete targets creates flexibility in the extent to which CDR could be allowed to substitute for emission reductions, which could be problematic and, among other things, lead to a moral hazard when unrealistic betting on carbon removal may delay needed emission reduction efforts. In terms of types of CDR, we find that nature-based carbon removal is the most frequently referred to approach mentioned in the strategies, and carbon sequestration in forests and soils is mentioned in all 25 strategies, and specifically countries refer to forest and land management techniques to improve the sink capacity. The third most popular nature-based approach is harvested wood products, and it's described as an alternative to a standing forest for long-term carbon storage, as well as a substitute to high emission-intensive materials. And that, not surprisingly, blue carbon sink is mentioned most frequently in strategies of coastal countries. In comparison, engineered CDR is less frequently referred to in the strategies compared to nature-based carbon removal. Bioenergy with carbon capture and storage is the most popular, followed by direct air capture, enhanced weathering, ocean liming, and biochar. Note that naming conventions of categories of CDR and classifications of CDR mentioned on this slide is an open discussion. So some concluding remarks. In the analysis of long-term strategies, we find that there is a sense of anticipation for CDR, but no concrete targets and policy plans are proposed. For example, how to incentivize development and implementation. There is a focus on nature-based CDR, not so much on engineered carbon removal, as we would expect to see in long-term planning. In terms of implications, specifications regarding timing and scale are essential if climate targets are to be achieved with or without CDR. And lastly, discussions about CDR's potential and opportunity engender a sense of hope, yet might delay necessary action if there are no specific targets and plans in place. Thank you very much. Over to you, Gunilla.
Thank you very much, Alexandra. Excellent time management. Now we turn to Geden, who is joining us online. So I guess Mathias will help out with that.
So Oliver, I think you can hear us now, right?
I can hear you. I have heard you before. I can see myself on the screen.
Perfect.
At least partly, and I think you're going to start the presentation.
Yes, there you go. And when you want me to change the slide, just tell me.
All right. So I'm going to talk about residual emissions as a part of the growing CDR debate, and from an IPCC working group, 3 perspective where I have been a lead author. Next slide, please. So what you can see here is the headline statement in C11. C11 is that part of the summary for policymakers that solely deals with carbon dioxide removal. Of course, the underlining here is done by me, but I'm going to read the two first sentences to you. I actually drafted and then negotiated this, so I've been involved with government's concerns about this. The deployment of CDR to counterbalance hard-to-abate residual emissions is unavoidable if net zero CO2 or GHG emissions are to be achieved. The scale and timing of deployment will depend on the trajectories of gross emissions reductions in different sectors. So what you can see here that hard-to-abate residual emissions are explicitly given as a reason to deal with CDR early on. In plain language, it simply says if you have a net zero CO2 or GHG emissions target, you will have some CDR because there will be hard to abate residual emissions. So that means, coming from the summary for policymakers, that residual emissions are going to be a major component of the future CDR debate. Next slide, please. Here you see a conceptual figure coming out of a cross-chapter box on CDR in Chapter 12. Chapter 12 is basically the hub for carbon dioxide removal in the Working Group 3 report. There is no dedicated chapter on this. And it's a conceptual, a stylized pathway without numbers given for volumes. And it's more about the components. You can read that as a global pathway, but also as a national. And the components in modeled pathways are that above the zero line, or here it's called the net zero line, you have residual emissions of non-CO2 greenhouse gases left. It's mainly from agriculture, methane and nitrous oxide. You have also an element of fossil CO2 from industry or aviation, but you also have, and that's unusual, to show that residual emissions from land use, quite often land use and managed land and forestry is only shown as net values. Then below the zero line in dark green is the removal we're already doing on managed land. It's often forgotten. Carbon dioxide removal is not a thing of the future, and that might be complemented by other removals during the century. What's important here is the two net emissions lines for GHG and the dashed one for CO2. Net zero GHG will be achieved later than net zero CO2 for the simple reason that we only have carbon dioxide removal and not methane removal or nitrous oxide removal. So you counterbalance non-CO2 with CO2, which gets you to net zero CO2 earlier, and which also gets you to net negative CO2 already at the point of net zero GHG. And what's important here, that we always tried to show gross emissions and gross removals and not to work with net values only, because, for example, for land use and forestry, it often does, let's say, lead to the misconception that getting land use emissions into net negative or to net zero first is only a thing of upscaling CDR. Next slide, please. That is an SPM figure, SPM 5. I only want to talk about what I put here into the red box. These are, you can see, so-called illustrative mitigation pathways, so different strategies of reaching climate target. It's not always about the same temperature target. These strategies we have here, they all involve carbon dioxide removal, as you can see below the zero line, but the volumes and the sectoral composition of residual emissions and CDR differ across global illustrative mitigation pathways. This is at the time of net zero CO2, so it means the colored parts have the same volumes, but then you always have the gray part of non-CO2 above it. And since this is done in the usual way, integrated assessment models are asked to report their values you find LULUCF, so the removals on managed land or the emissions on managed land, only as net values here below the zero line in the light green. So if you had gross emissions on managed land and gross removals, you would have them on both sides of the zero line, and the volumes would be larger, which is also the reason why there are no total numbers right now for CDR in the report. Because the land use change numbers are a little bit problematic, and they're only given as net values. Next slide, please, and that's the last one with a lot of discussion points, actually. So this SPM and more than the report as such, because of the way the SPM highlights residual emissions as a reason to do CDR, is likely to shift the research and policy debate. First, the fundamentals. I think we need definitions, better definitions of residual emissions, of hard-to-abate emissions, of hard-to-transition sectors. I mean, residual is quite clear, it's just what's left, but hard-to-abate and hard-to-transition will become, let's say, contested terms. They're used differently in the modeling communities than what we will see now in policy design, but also, let's say, in the politics or in climate politics, where it will not be just about economics or technological issues. There can be other political reasons why some emissions will be hard to abate. In pathways and feasibility, I think it will start with scrutinizing what actually leads to residual emissions in global and national models. They tend to be quite high. In global models, in national models in the European Union, it's often like 10% of the 1919 values. You can see that in the UK and in the EU. It will also be interesting to explore what are major shifts after going through net zero. Is it just about upscaling CDR or further downscaling residual emissions? And we will get debates about feasibility constraints in bringing residual emissions down. And last point on governance and political economy, I think there is a danger that some sectors, and of course it will be agriculture first, simply argue, well, science says so. There are residual emissions, and our emissions, or a large chunk, are residual emissions, so nothing can be done about that. But accepting that there will be hard to abate or impossible to abate residual emissions, the next question in governance will there be sectoral responsibilities for counterbalancing these, or can agriculture just say, well, somebody gonna deliver CDR, it's not our problem? Or as we see in the European Union now, might there be attempts to say, well, the sector might have residual emissions, but the sector itself will be responsible for counterbalancing. And one innovation we might see in governance are sub-targets, not only for CDR, but also for residual emissions overall, capping them, and also maybe capping them for certain sectors. Next slide, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Oliver. Next speaker is Liv Lundberg, so please.
Okay, thank you very much, Gunilla. So my name is Liv Lundberg. I'm a researcher at RISE, Research Institute of Sweden, and I will talk about more concrete policy options to incentivize carbon dioxide removals. And as Alexandra talked about earlier, there are many different types of carbon dioxide removal, and two very crude categories are these more nature-based, where we have, for example, reforestation, agricultural practices, etc. And then we have these more engineered removals, or sometimes called industrial removals. And here we have bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, direct air capture. And they are quite different, these types of removals. And I will focus on policies for these engineering removals, The nature-based solutions are also very important, but as Alexandra mentioned, there are less policy options for engineer removals today, so it's interesting to see what is going on here. And when these removals, they are usually requiring large investments, and even once you have built the facility, it requires continuous running cost because they are quite energy intensive, a lot of them. And at the same time, there's not really a lot of co-benefits, as you might find for more natural-based solutions. And both bioenergy with carbon capture and storage and direct air capture are quite new methods. Means part of the technologies are developed, but it's not really there on a commercial scale today. At the same time, these technologies, they have a high durability. The hope is that the carbon that we remove will be taken away for thousands of years from the atmosphere. And there's also a high potential that we could do this on a large scale. And a lot of the climate models that are looking at how could we meet the Paris Agreement targets, they assume that we will have quite a lot of these engineering removals. So we probably need to start looking into policies for them already today. And of course, it takes time to develop these technologies on a large scale. So the first step is probably that we need research grants, pilot grants, feasibility studies, and demonstration subsidies. And I would say that we're already here today, at least in some countries, we have these parts. But as these are large investments that usually takes probably 15, 20 years to pay back, and we also have this continuous running cost. And there's not really anything else, no other co-benefits that we could use to finance them. We need long-term finance solutions for these options. It's not even like solar and wind power, for example. Once you build them, they are running for almost free. These ones you need to keep on paying to get these removals. So to get them onto the market, at least now in the beginning, we might need government intervention and policies. And we could have investment subsidies. Here we could have, for example, grants, as the EU Innovation Fund have. There could be loans, there could be credits. But as I said, it still costs a lot of money to run these facilities. So we might also need more result-based subsidies or production subsidies, or we could even call it procurement of these credits. So here the government may go in and pay a certain amount per ton of carbon dioxide that is removed from the atmosphere. And this could be done, for example, through tax credits, reverse auction, procurement auctions. Could also be types of contracts for difference, or some more flat rate payment. And I would say that it hasn't really been a lot going on, but now the last few years, a lot has started to happen with these policies. So I'm just going to give you some example of things going on today. In the US, they have a tax credit, 45Q tax credit, where actors could get up to $50 for storing carbon underground. There's also quite some research support for DAC, direct air capture. There is this Carbon Dioxide Removal Leadership Act. It was suggested in the New York State, but it didn't pass there. But now it's a bill on a federal level in both Congress and Senate. We're talking about it. And that would mean that the state would buy these kind of carbon dioxide removal credits from different actors, and it could be from different types of methods. And the UK, there is also quite some funding for carbon dioxide removal technologies, more on research R&D scale. There's also some demonstrations. Here we also, in the UK, we have also something called Ccs Clusters, so carbon capture and storage. So this is both for capturing fossil emissions from, for example, industry, power plants. But one of the clusters that has been approved, it's also containing Drax, which is a huge power plant that has turned more and more towards biomass. So if they start to capture that carbon, it can be a huge BECCS facility. And the idea with these clusters is also to help with transportation to storage sites. Then, of course, there is a lot of going on in the whole European Union level, and I will leave it to Florian. You will hopefully learn a lot about that later. But there's also some initiatives in individual countries. Like in Ireland and Luxembourg, they are right now working on some policy proposals, for example, using reverse auctions to incentivize, and also the tariff. more flat rate payment. And then we have Sweden, where I'm from, and in Sweden we are preparing to use reverse auctions for BECCS. And so I will talk a little bit more about Sweden, both since it's an interesting example. I don't know of any other country that has come this far to actual policy for these types of technologies. And I also working a little bit with the Swedish Energy Agency that is launching this system. So Sweden has this net zero goal for 2045, and we allow up to 15% of the emissions to be offset with carbon dioxide removal. And this amounts to approximately 10 million tons of CDR per year in 2045. Sweden also has huge potential for BECCS, mainly from district heating and the paper and pulp industry. As you can see we have this picture on the screen, some kind of graph, and we see there that we have up to 30 million tons of biogenic emissions per year that could be captured. And as you see, we only need 10 of them to reach the net zero goal. At the same time, the industry in Sweden, I would say, are very interested in this. There's a lot of going on, a lot of interest. And we also have Stockholm Exergi is a front runner. They have received funding from the European Innovation Fund. And this is they have a power plant, and it's run with biomass, and we want to make it into a BECCS facility. And it's almost 0.8 million tons of biogenic carbon per year, so it's a quite substantial amount. And then, so finally, Sweden is they have been supporting feasibility studies, pilot and research plans for a few years now. So this has helped the industry to get going with this. And then the plan is to actually launch the first reverse auction starting this year. And it will only be for BECCS in Sweden, since that is where we see the potential. And the budget is approximately 3.6 billion euros between 2026 and 2046. So if we have a price of approximately 120 euros per ton, this would amount to about 2 million tons of carbon dioxide removal per year by 2030. So it still is quite a lot of money, and it's still only 2 million tons, and we need to get to 10 million tons. So the question is, how should we pay for the rest of it? And so in the long run, we might need other policy options as well that the government doesn't pay for. And that is what Mathias will talk a little bit more about now. So thank you very much.
Okay, approaching the Q&A quickly. But first, something about removal obligations, and then we move on to the European Union and what's happening there. So removal obligations and whether it's actually relevant to link it to carbon border adjustments. I know this topic is a little bit further down the policy pipeline, but I want to explain the logic behind this reasoning that actually carbon border adjustment might become relevant also for carbon removal in a distant but perhaps not so distant future. And I want to exemplify this first, explain this, and then exemplify this by the European Union policy in the forestry sector and eventually also perhaps agriculture. So Liv talked about the recent focus on supply push instruments, but eventually if we want to achieve scale, we also need to sort of move towards demand pull instruments of various kinds. And when doing so, we typically want to level competitiveness between different producers of goods that could also produce these goods with carbon removal. So one very simple example would be two identical papers competing on the same market for customers, and one paper is produced with removal, with bioenergy carbon capture and storage, and another without removal. Of course, the paper with removal will cost more to produce, and someone have to pay that cost in order for that paper to be able to compete with other paper on the same market, basically. The same goes for other types of removals, so in agriculture, in biofuel production, in heat and power production, and so on and so forth, or buildings, or wherever we have this potential. It's usually that you have to level the playing field here if we want to achieve scale. When we look at how governments plan for this, and when we talk with governmental representatives, they typically look for instruments with low administrative burden, both for the government, but also for these sectors targeted for removals. And they would also start looking into instruments that have low cost to governments, typically actually cost neutral to governments. So it's not to scale up reverse auctions, for example, to achieve scale, because it's going to be perhaps too costly for many governments to accept. When doing so, there are a few instruments that are discussed in the literature and among policy circles as well, and one is fees and dividends, so fees on emissions and dividends to removal actors, or we have been discussing removal credits in cap-and-trade systems. There is also the possibility to have a deposit and removal sort of refund scheme, which is similar to fees and dividends, but you separate sort of the return or the refund in time from the actual deposit that you have to do when you emit. But more and more we're talking about removal obligations and possibly linked to certificate trade, but removal obligations. And I know this concept have many names. We have been talking in the Swedish debate about quota obligations. We have been talking about recovery liabilities. We have also been discussing this concept in terms of carbon take-back obligations, but they virtually mean the same thing. So a removal obligation put on a specific collective to make sure that removals occur or carbon removal occur. And the collectives typically are either consumers of goods with large climate impact, that could be meat and dairy products or international air travelers or things like this, or it's producers that emit a lot of greenhouse gases in hard to abate sectors. It's typically discussed in terms of cement and steel and things like this. Or it's producers in sectors with technical potential for removal, so paper and pulp or biofuels and all this that we've been mentioning before. If we put this removal obligation on the production side, we are actually going to increase the cost of production, either for cement and steel or whatnot, or for those goods that are produced in sectors with removal potential. And if that is happening, if that's where we put obligation, and these sectors are trade exposed, which is often the case, then there is a risk of carbon leakage, and then also it makes sense to start looking into carbon border adjustments in order to prevent this leakage from happening and to level the playing field, basically preventing or mitigating this competitive disadvantage that occurs. So just to give you an example, in the European Union where we have both of these elements in discussion currently, the carbon border adjustment mechanism, CBAM, and removal obligations in the forestry sector, and in the future perhaps also in the agriculture sector. So the EU climate policy, basically you have this economy-wide target. We have one for 2030, of course, and one for 2050. Let's focus on 2030, minus 55%. We have the different sort of pillars carrying up this economy-wide target, the effort sharing regulation, the emissions trading system, the land use change and forestry regulation. And they cover different sectors. So typically transport, buildings, agriculture in effort sharing regulation and so on. Industry and power to a high degree in the emissions trading system, and then forestry mostly nowadays in the land use change and forestry regulation. And they contribute differently to fulfilling the target, of course. The cap, the overall economy-wide target. So I want you to focus on the furthest right here, the land use change and forestry regulation. The proposal right now is that it should contribute with 310 megatons net removals by 2030. And this is effectively a removal obligation that you put on member states in the European Union. So we already have removal obligations that are transferred, of course, to foresters in the different member states. We have the CBAM, the border adjustment mechanism, being discussed to prevent leakage in the industry and power sector, in some of the industry sectors, especially if we're moving towards phasing out free allocation in the emissions trading system. And we are looking to, or the European Commission, I believe, wants to extend the land use change and forestry regulation to manage land, and eventually also to move agriculture from effort sharing into the LULUCF regulation, making it into an agriculture and forestry regulation, basically. In doing so, we're actually moving, we have the mandatory removal obligations or caps, we have trade exposed sectors, forestry and agriculture, and we're actually moving a substantial emissions source from effort sharing into the LULUCF regulation, and that's agriculture, almost 400 megatons annually. We also know that the removal potential is high in agriculture, but the actual carbon removal has decreased over the last 15 years. So the removal is substantially less and declining. So we need to do something about this. Of course, removal obligations could prevent or could include or provide incentives to start removing carbon in these sectors. But who should finance that? And that's the key question, of course, that is problematic. If the finance requirement is put on foresters and farmers, of course, we have a situation where production costs will increase for farming in the European Union and for producing forest goods. So then, of course, it also makes sense to start looking into whether we need to expand CBAM into these sectors beyond the emissions trading system. If someone else should pay for it, it's hard to know exactly who it should be in this structure. Especially as we start phasing out the fossil emissions from the European economy. It's becoming more and more hard to identify the appropriate collective to pay for this, if it's not the sectors with removal potential. So takeaway messages: when we move from a fossil-based energy system to a decarbonized energy system, who should pay for additional removal? Is it sectors with removal potential? If it is, if you put removal obligations on trade-exposed sectors with removal potential, you actually increase the cost of production, you risk carbon leakage, and then you can start motivating a border adjustment. And I think this might become relevant in a not-so-distant future, depending on how EU policy is developing, which is then a perfect next topic for the panel, I think, for Florian to speak on. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mathias. And yeah, turning to Florian.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, thanks for the invitation. So my name is Florian Claeys. I'm working in DG Clima in the European Commission in the unit on land economy and carbon removals. So I've been asked to deliver you a presentation on the sustainable carbon cycles policies that we are implementing in the Commission, and we are proposing to the Parliament and Council to be decided. So mid-December, we have launched communications that we're trying to implement these different acts and actions that we want to promote to introduce some sustainable carbon cycles in the EU. The idea is, of course, to achieve the climate neutrality by 2050 and to generate negative emissions thereafter. That's the goals of the climate law. To do that, so we need to drastically reduce the use of fossil carbon, which is, of course, the first priority, but we need also to increase carbon removals, both on nature-based solutions and engineered solutions, and also to recycle and reuse more the carbon, including the carbon from biogenic sources. So the communication has been published on the 15th of December and includes several working documents, one about the vision for 2050 climate neutrality and another one on carbon farming. So my presentation will go a bit more in depth on these elements, and at the end of the presentation I will slightly present you some elements of the next regulation that we are aiming to propose, which is this carbon removal certificate framework. So the idea with carbon farming that has been introduced in the Farm to Fork strategy is to implement a new green business model for land manager in order for them to receive more incomes when they are shifting to practices that allow them to generate carbon sequestration. So it's quite broad in terms of scope, as it can cover all solutions based on soils, also in forestry, and one of the big scope is also agricultural lands. The idea is, as we mentioned, it was Mrs. Lundberg saying that there is several co-benefits when we're doing that, and one idea is, of course, to highlight the benefits in terms of biodiversity, but also in terms of adaptation. as when you are implementing carbon farming solutions, you're also increasing the climate resilience to climate impacts. So several examples in terms of afforestation, reforestation, so some forest-based approaches. It could also cover peatlands and wetlands. It can also cover agroforestry. It can cover croplands, grasslands, and there is also the possibility for blue carbon that have also been mentioned in one of the previous presentations. So you can see that there are several agricultural and forestry practices, including also land management and restoration or protection that can be relevant for carbon farming. In the communication, so it's not some targets, but some aspirational challenges, I would say. The idea is, first, as we want to ensure that all these carbon removals are robust and based on the best available sciences, there is a need to improve the access for all land managers to verifiable emissions and removal data. So that's a aim that we have for 2028 with the implementation of geographically explicit land monitoring data. There is also this objective of 310 megatons of removals, which is enshrined in the LULUCF regulation, and on which we can see a lot of potentials for carbon farming. In terms of actions, so there will be the creation of an expert group that will be launched this summer. We're also highlighting several sources of financing. It could be under Horizon Europe or under Innovation Fund or under LIFE projects, for example. There are several studies also that we are launching, including a study on polluter pays principle based on agriculture. So that may provide a beginning of an answer for one of the questions that we're raising, Mathias. And yeah, several other platforms that can help land managers to do these kind of activities. In addition to carbon farming, we're also looking on all the engineered solutions, so the industrial carbon use, transport, and storage of carbon. The idea is slightly to move to a creation of an internal market for such activities. It can be based on products, so saying that we will try to replace energy-intensive materials like cement, steel with some bio-based materials which are storing carbon. It can be harvested wood products. It can be also some other bio-based products, including from agricultural production. Idea also is to transform the CO2 that is from a waste as a product and a resource for all kind of new materials and chemicals and fuels. As well, we will still need to use carbon for chemistry, and the idea is to ensure that this carbon is coming from sustainable sources and it can be reused in cycle. Of course, a lot of things on remove carbon from the atmospheres, including with CCS options. Some examples. So, as part of this communication, we have highlighted the Swedish example of Exergis project financed by the EU Innovation Fund. We're also highlighting several works and policies initiatives on fibers. You may have seen the textile strategy, for example, where we are trying to push for new products based on bio-based products that can store carbon. One of the examples, of course, is wood-based construction products. That is one of the main output for such example. So some elements also on the industrial CCS and CCU. So as I was saying, that under the Innovation Fund, so which is connected to the ETS, there is some rooms for direct air capture, which is eligible to the Innovation Fund calls. There are also some possibilities on CCS onshore and offshore. So like for carbon farming, we have set some aspirational challenges. So it is that by 2028, all CO2 captured, transport, used, and stored should be reported and accounting. So the idea is to be sure to discriminate what is coming from biogenic sources, atmospheric sources, and fossil fuel sources. When we have this data, the idea is by 2030 to ensure that 1/5 of all this carbon is used in chemicals and plastics coming from non-fossil sources. And we have set a target, which is still aspirational, of 5 megatons of industrial carbon removals. On that, there is also several pieces of governance and methodologies and studies that we are launching. I will provide you the link for you to be able to look at that. Next step is its regulatory framework for the certification of carbon removals on which my unit is working on. So we are preparing the impact assessment. So we have first collected several evidence that was a call launched at the first semester and that is now closed, but we have received like hundreds of contributions, so that's a very good amount of materials and food for thought. We have also gathered several stakeholders with a conference end of January, and I will provide you the link for you to be able to see this conference. And the legislative proposal will be for the end of the year. This proposal also will include some robust certification requirements in terms of measurement and monitoring, in terms of additionality, of duration of storage, which is one of the elements that have been highlighted as quite key for this kind of activities. Also some elements on benefits and safeguards. We will also put some elements on the governance frameworks, but the idea is really to have a unified framework for all kind of removals, so be it based on nature or based on technology. Of course, there are still some specificities, and we will open some options on how to better, to be more, for more tailored out rules or applications for both carbon farming, product-based carbon removals, and geological storage. All the links that I've mentioned to you, so you have the links with the studies, the conference, and the webpage of the Commission. Thank you very much, and I will try to answer to your questions if there are.
Thank you, Florian. Thank you, all panelists, for very interesting presentations. We will now open up the floor, and we will pass around a microphone. And is Oliver still with us?
Yes.
Okay, great. Good. So I think we will collect 3 questions, perhaps, first. So we actually have 3. So that's very, very good. Indra, do you see the hands? Could just pass the mic on. And please state your name and affiliation, please.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for the interesting presentations. Oras Tynkkynen, representing a Finnish research project on carbon dioxide use and removal, and would be very interesting to work together. I actually have 2 questions, if you don't mind. Firstly, I think it has been established that we would be needing CDR in midterm for residual emissions and in the longer term to get to net negative emissions, but there is possibly an understanding that we might actually be needing CDR also in the shorter term to increase ambition. And I wonder if you would agree with that understanding that there might be a paradigm shift in terms of the timescales when we will be needing CDR, and if that is indeed the case, whether then policy action would also need to accelerate, and I'm referring to the EU aspirational target of 5 megatons by 2030. And then the second question is related to incentivizing CDR, and I'm thinking of technical removals in particular. You did refer to possibly integrating CDR into carbon pricing and more specifically the EU emissions trading scheme. I wonder if you could elaborate on that, the challenges and possibilities there.
Thank you. And then we had the next question.
Yes, thank you very much. Axel Michaelova from Perspectives Climate Research at the University of Zurich. My question would relate, how would you see the role of international carbon markets under Article 6, given that, of course, very frequently the storage locations are different from the capture locations? And in that context, how would you see the requirements for permanence and the MRV to ensure that we don't get into kind of removal havens with limited regulation?
Thank you. And then, we had the gentleman in the back, white shirt.
Thanks very much. Mathias with Perspectives Climate Research. My question is to the gentleman from the EU Commission. I noted the formulation, I think it was regarding the CRCM, it is to contribute to the 310 megaton target. By contribute to, does that allude to the need for additional measures, policy decisions, or does that represent the primary tool to achieve that? Noting also the need for a demand pull, which was pointed out by Lundberg before. Thanks.
Thank you. Who would like to start? Florian, perhaps.
Yeah, so thanks a lot for the questions. Yeah, so we're getting the target that have been mentioned. So, yeah, the sustainable carbon cycles communication. So that was the really first document in the EU that was trying to highlight what could be the potentials for removals. I mean, industrial removals by 2030, which is in only 8 years. Of course, on all the land sector, we are aiming for much more targets. So you have the -310, and yeah. So you mentioning that there will be a need to accelerate the implementation of CDR technologies and, well, the importance of removals. That I think bit the scope of the Fit for 55 package, which is as part of this acceleration. As for the moment, we're still in this -40% in terms of implementation of the climate energy framework. We have this climate law, which is proposing to go to, which is enshrining to go to 55%, and all the pillars that Mathias are mentioning are still being negotiated. So you may have seen that there have been the vote of the Parliament this week. The Council is still continuing to discuss on that. So we are within this move, saying that we need to accelerate and to be much more ambitious, including at short terms. How it will translate with the CCS and all these industrial technologies aspects? Well, we need to put several aspects also in the sectoral policies. So we will try to review the directive on CCS. There is also, as part of the circular economy regulations, I mean the CPR, for example, the construction product regulation, but also all the product environmental footprints. We are trying also to strengthen the criteria for climate performance of products. And as part of this enhanced climate performance, it's a better acknowledgement of the carbon removals. So we cannot commit on some specific targets for that, but we are trying to push all actors to be able to highlight what they are doing in terms of carbon removals. Regarding the questions of Axel on the role of international markets, so the EU framework is a domestic one for the moment. Of course, there is a Brussels effect, meaning that if we are implementing such initiative in the EU, we will try also to discuss with other parties to see what they can do also on their side, and try to establish some exchange of good practices. We consider also that by setting some robust criteria on the carbon removal certificate framework, we could also inspire the rules under Article 6, including for removals activities, which is under the supervisory body mandate for the moment. In terms of permanence, that's effectively a large difficulty. There is several tools that we can consider, and these tools have to be adapted also to the different kind of removal activities. On the land, you may have some tools like some protections associated to the land ownership that can exist in some member states, so we have to look at these options. But for most cases, we will need to have some short-term contract. Well, short-term meaning that if you want to promote farmers to do some removals, of course you cannot ask farmers to engage for 100 years, because most of them will not own the land, and they cannot commit for the next decades. But still, we need to incentivize them to do some removals, and we could work on some temporary credits, for example. That could be one possibility well, we know that we had some bad experience under the Kyoto Protocol with that, but now that we are entering in this world where most of the emissions are covered by climate neutrality pledge, there might be more room for maneuvers for such credits. Yeah, perhaps I will stop here and let you speak also.
Shall we move on? Yeah. Yeah, so there was a question about cap and trade, or the EU ETS, and whether we should include removals in the cap and trade system in the European Union, perhaps elsewhere as well. It's already included in the New Zealand cap and trade system, for example, forest removals. So there are such examples. I think we have explored this opportunity. I think there are many possibilities, but also many problems with such an approach. One problem, of course, is the issue of residual emissions that Oliver spoke about. What type of emissions do we actually want CDR to be allowed to offset? And in the ETS, we have emissions that we can abate, so perhaps we should reserve removal for other sectors where it's harder to abate emissions. So that could be one issue. especially if the system is not rigged in a way that, let's say, maintains the transformation pressure on fossil industry to decarbonize, because they can find cheaper solutions from removal, for example. But there are opportunities. I think we should start exploring then possibly engineered removal in sectors that are already included in the system, with emissions that are already included but accounted for as zero, and that could be pulp and paper, for example, or electricity production, where you could use bioenergy carbon capture and storage to remove carbon dioxide, and that could then be acknowledged as a negative emission within the system. It's not so hard to rig the system to acknowledge this, but then you would definitely have to think about how to maintain the transformation or the pressure to transform fossil industry. Also, you would really have to consider, especially for bioenergy carbon capture and storage, you would really have to consider the sustainability safeguards. And I know those are explored under the Renewable Energy Directive. I think the Commission's proposal is actually to not account all biogenic emissions in the ETS as carbon neutral any longer, unless they fulfill the Renewable Energy Directive sustainability criteria, and those are being strengthened. I'm not sure if it's enough, but it's at least a good start, I think, to try to address that problem. So I think we're moving towards the possibility of doing this, but there are still big question marks on how to design the system. On scaling up ambition, I think that's also a really good question, whether we should really only reserve CDR for residual emissions, or whether it should also be used to scale up ambition in the near term. I think that's probably more because it's really important to acknowledge that CDR may actually lower the global, the peaking year, or make the global peaking year earlier, or lower the peak, lower the temperature overshoot, for example, and that's a very valuable contribution. I think that's more for the more immediate removal options that Florian talked about in the agriculture and forestry sector, perhaps, where you can have quick effect in the short term, but perhaps in the future also for engineered removal. On AR6 carbon markets, perhaps you want to speak to that issue, Liv? I'm not sure, and because this is a big debate in Sweden, especially in relation to the auction system that we are designing.
Yeah, I mean, I could start a little bit just with this question about hiring ambitions and looking more into the short term. So, of course, that's great to increase ambition, and I think also there are other reasons to look at policies more in the short term. I mean, these, especially if we look at the engineered solutions like DACs and BECS, I mean, these methods are not really, they're not there on a commercial scale today. It's just like demonstration facilities. And I mean, you both need the actual capture, and then you need to store it, you need to transport it, but you also need all of the systems around for this. So there's a lot to test out. In Sweden, we mentioned the Stockholm Exergi, and the most ambitious actors like them, they talk about maybe 2025, 2026 they could be in operation, and that's still some years away. And other actors are more talking 2030, and that is if we implement policies today, because they need to know that they are going to get paid for what they do. So I think there is an urgency in implementing policies for this also, because it takes such a long time, and if we want this on a really large global scale by 2045 or 2050, we need to start now to make sure that this is up and running. And yeah, regarding Article 6, of course that is going to be an important issue. I know in Sweden, probably most of the captured carbon right now, it seems like it's going to end up in Norway. We have their storage there. But it's still, I mean, the plan for Sweden is, of course, to account for that in our national accounting. And I know there are bilateral talks with Norway, but it's going to be a lot of that to detangle. And of course, also, if you start to have private markets that are going to pay for part of the emissions, and you could have international companies coming and buying emissions in Sweden or something, then there's also going to be a question of where should this be accounted for. And that is a debate and discussion in Sweden today, how to have this private market at the same time as we also have the Swedish government paying for these credits, to make sure that there is no double counting, and that we still have the pressure to mitigate as well. So yeah, that's some thoughts.
Thank you. Oliver and Alexandra, do you have any additional comments?
A quick comment from me on using CDR to raise ambition and how it's framed in the long-term strategies at the moment. So often countries refer either to emission reduction or carbon dioxide removal. And if a country, for instance, has a capacity for CDR, especially nature-based CDR, it's often framed as an opportunity. Definitely use that as an emission reduction option. But whether that is going to lead to a raised ambition is a hard to answer question if there are no specific targets for CDR and for emission reductions. So at the moment, as this long-term planning stands right now, it's hard to say that relying on CDR to raise ambitions is going to lead to actual greater reductions in the future.
Yeah, maybe if I can add on that, is this, I'm a little bit confused because I'm hearing it on two angles. Now it's better. I would say that in the European Union, and we're all from the European Union here, and that's maybe a little bit complicated in the way we talk about it, because we're just talking about our own regulatory system here. It's, I would say we will not have the problem of Article 6 right now. We can do a lot of removals within the European Union. But MOV is going to be an issue, and there will be a Brussels effect if the European Union is the first regulatory area that goes into certification and takes it really seriously. It will influence other actors. But the US is doing it, the UK is doing it. We see it in the voluntary markets. So there will be a competition about MOV system, and hopefully it's not a competition, a downwards competition for that. On the accelerating mitigation in the short term, I think it's a new concept. It's also in the SPM, but it's more complementing the logic of you can use it for getting net zero, you can use it for negative, but then you can also use it to be more ambitious. I think it's an attempt to reframe carbon dioxide removal as not being in danger of creating more hazard, but leading to ambition.
Thank you. Do we have any additional questions, perhaps? Yes.
Thank you. This is for Mr. Fridahl. My name is Mary Helmick. I'm an analyst at the Berlin-based climate think tank at Delphi. To go to your presentation on connecting removals to the CBAM, do you mean just expanding to sectors that are not currently covered under the legislation, like forestry? Or if, for example, there are removal obligations placed on the steel sector, which will be included, how could the legislation be adapted to account for removals? And then that also would, of course, require accounting for removals of third-party countries exporting to the EU, and then verification internationally, and how big of a task would that be? Thank you.
Thanks. We had an additional question here, I think. Just behind you, Indra. No, yeah. Sorry.
Two.
Yeah, two more.
Okay. Yeah, it fits nicely with your question. Malte Winkler from Perspectives. I also wanted to ask about the CBAM and ask how you, if you can give some idea of if that is anticipated already in the current legislation, or if a lot has to be done to get it in there, the CDR points there, or how is it looking at the moment? Thanks.
My name is Martin Kames. I'm with the Öko Institute, and I thank you for the workshop and the presentations. I have a question to Oliver. You mentioned residual emissions and also heavy to abate sectors. I think residual emissions is just descriptive, but the heavy to abate involves a judgment. And I wonder whether you can elaborate a little bit on what are the logic behind distinguishing between hard to abate and the others. Thank you.
Thanks. Mathias, would you like to start, perhaps?
Sure. Really hard questions, or complicated questions, I would say. I'm just throwing this out because I think it might be relevant in a not so distant future, especially if if you put the removal obligations on these sectors with potential for removal without sort of compensating for it somehow with external finance. So then, of course, we need to do something about the disadvantages they get in trade because they are trade exposed, these sectors, forestry and agriculture. Exactly how to do it, whether it's a separate CBAM of some kind or if we expand the existing CBAM into these markets, I'm not sure, and I definitely haven't seen any preparations for this. Maybe Florian have to correct me if I'm wrong, but I haven't seen the CBAM being designed in such a way that it should be in the future expanded to agriculture and forestry regulation that is anticipated. But I think you alluded to the concept of polluter pays principle. And then that would mean that, you know, you would put the obligation on polluting sectors. Perhaps that would be steel and cement or something else, I'm not sure. But if that's the case, then of course the CBAM is already in place for those sectors, and it's easier also with the MRV, the verification in other countries for removal activities. I think that's, I mean, it's really complicated in the European Union. It's going to be extremely complicated in an international system. But these are the kinds of questions that we need to start asking and prepare for, because I think they might become relevant. I don't foresee a future where everyone have the same kind of removal obligation put on the same sectors in the same time globally. It's not going to happen. So we probably have to start addressing this question. Unless we work with the consumption side, then we still have the verification problem. You need to verify removal in other countries, but then you might not need the actual border adjustment. So I think those were the questions posed to me. Yeah.
Liv, would you like to say something?
Do you have any comment on
No?
this?
And Florian?
Well, not a lot of things to complement, and that, well, you may have seen that at the Parliament there have been a reject of the ETS, CBAM and social fund, so there will be some new negotiations on that at the Parliament level. The Commission proposal, it was not proposed to include sectors other than those that are covered by the ETS. There is a link with agriculture, with fertilizers. There are some installations that are covered by the ETS, so fertilizers should be covered by CBAM. So for the future of CBAM, well, let's see first if we manage to be created.
Thank you. Maybe Oliver, would you like to address the third question that was to you?
Yeah, there was a question on residual emissions, and Martin is right. Residual just means, okay, it's left, or it's supposed to be left, or it's expected to be left. And then it is really about the criteria. And if you look at modeling, then let's say as the practice that creates residual emissions in the way we expect them, because we're talking about something that is happening around net zero or after, then often it is about practices where no mitigation option exists. Let's say for methane from livestock, the only mitigation option would be eating no to less meat. And there you already get into value judgments about, is it actually hard to abate, or in which way is it actually hard to abate? Nitrous oxide from agriculture as well, aviation as well. Then let's say CO2 emissions from cement production, because it's not about the energy input mainly, but about the chemical processes. In clinker production, I would say it's hard to abate, but there are ways that it does in the end not appear as a residual emission if you, for example, use CCS, or if somebody invents new cement chemistry, which we don't know about. So we're making a judgment about something that might appear or not in 30 years from now, which is problematic. But quite often in modeling, there are also economic considerations. So if not only it might be impossible, but sometimes it might be possible, but in the models or in the scenarios, it might be too costly, and there it becomes problematic. Or quite often you have assumptions about not discontinuing operations, let's say, of a power plant, of a fossil fuel power plant, prematurely, then you have sometimes strange effects in modeling that if you allow for certain volumes or certain types of carbon dioxide removal in your model, then it creates residual emissions actually, because the model then goes towards choosing carbon dioxide removal and leaving other processes running. So if you do that, if you do it, let's say, strictly in a macroeconomic way, you might end up, let's say, in Europe with residual emissions of like 10% or more of the 1919 values. But you could also say, go the other way around, like in all the German studies on net zero, they basically chose the remaining 5 percentage points we had between the upper level of the old 80 to 95% range, and just talk about that, because politically that seemed the only feasible option. So you have a 95 plus 5 system, but that will not work uniformly. I think a major issue in the European Union will be that we have a union-wide net zero target by 2050. And many countries during the negotiation about the climate law made clear they want to have it exactly like that. So in 2050, we're going to have countries that are above the zero line and others that are below the zero line. That might not be problematic if we have a large ETS that is harmonized in the European Union anyway, but with all the national targets, that will create political pressure. So Ireland, for example, right now, 33% of all emissions come from agriculture. So let's consider them to be hard to abate. Then the question is, what kind of political discussion will evolve around that? Will other countries say, oh, well, okay, they have all this agriculture, they want to keep it, so we're going net negative for Ireland? This is going to be very tricky politically. So that's also why it's a very interesting discussion. There might also be domestically political reasons why certain emissions become hard to abate, because you say, okay, these are sectors that have a lot of veto power, so let's just let them have them, their residual emissions. We will cover that with CDR. So it creates a lot of, let's say, flexibilities, but also room for gaming within a domestic or European climate policy. But still, I think we are going to need substantive levels of CDR, but we will see different ways of countries actually dealing with that. But I think the political debate will move towards looking very closely on what counts as residual emissions, what does hard to abate really mean, or that's one term that has been introduced, what might be hard to transition sectors, which does not mean it's impossible to transition them, but hard for many different reasons.
Thank you. I think we have time for some additional questions. If we have one down there again. Do you want to add something? Oh, no.
Mathias from Perspectives. My question is sort of putting things a bit together and asking perhaps naively, if the LULUCF regulation essentially creates a removal obligation, which I'm not sure it does that, but that's out of my expertise. But then we add carbon farming revenue into the mix. Do we then still need border carbon adjustment, or is this then taken care of because you basically cancel this out?
There was a question.
Oh, is there
I don't know. I'm not sure.
No, I think you could go.
Okay. Yeah, and apologize, I've not answered your questions also. Yeah, so on the LULUCF regulation, the objective of minus 310 is covering all land categories, so forest, cropland, grasslands, wetlands, and also other still wood products. We are proposing to enlarge the category, the category of harvested wood products to other kind of carbon storing products, mainly bio-based ones. But we are not opening this article to bags. It's still staying in the land sector for the removals. The different tools that we are considering, or policies to implement this enhanced ambition on the LULUCF, well, first of all, it could be the common agricultural policy. Well, there have been a strengthening of the the ambition of the green architecture of the CAP with enhanced conditionality, measures under the rural development programs, a new eco scheme that should be allowed also to provide some schemes looking like carbon farming, where subsidies could be based on results, and some of the results could be carbon results. That's what we are trying to do currently in the discussions we have member states, as this is still an ongoing process, where we are in the phases of discussing the draft CAP strategic plan that have been submitted by the countries. Other tools could be in terms on forestry, so to have a more stringent application of the cascading use principle, meaning that if you are harvesting wood from forest, it should be first dedicated to the longer use, meaning wood and construction, for example, and you are using these woods for bioenergy purposes only when you have no other possibility to use these woods otherwise. So the idea is really to optimize and to maximize the mitigation potential of all the forest wood-based sector. There are also some other synergies that we can establish with the biodiversity strategy. At the end of June, the Commission will adopt a proposal for a nature restoration law, where we will push member states to adopt some legally binding targets of restoration on different kind of ecosystems. For most of the ecosystems, when you are doing some restoration or protection, usually you have some carbon benefits, for most of them, including peatlands and forests. In some cases, it's not the case, but most of the case, there are some strong benefits between biodiversity and mitigation, and also adaptation and other ecosystem services. So that's a bit the tools that we are trying to push with the LULUCF regulation.
So maybe on the removal revenues, then, that you posed a question on, Mathias, if farmers or foresters get a revenue for removing carbon dioxide, of course, then that cover the cost of doing so, the increasing cost of production of harvested wood products or meat or whatever you produce, then of course you won't need a carbon border adjustment because then you have the income to cover the costs associated with removal. The problem, of course, is to identify who should bear that cost. There is no great appetite for governments to scale up, to bear the cost when you scale up removal to the extent suggested. Perhaps we could subsidize it, perhaps not, but I don't know what the financing source should be. The CBAM, the income from CBAM has been discussed as a possible financing source, but the European Union wants to use the income from CBAM for a lot of things, so probably not. Perhaps, I'm not sure. But otherwise you need to find someone who should pay for it, and perhaps then you need to have, let's say, a CBAM or a carbon border adjustment in relation to the paying sector, whatever that sector is, if that sector is trade exposed, and they instead have to sort of take responsibility for financing removal in other sectors. So it's a bit complicated, but it's possible that kind of situation also occurs. So we don't know yet. We'll have to find out in the future, but I think it's worth starting to explore this conceptually to be prepared, I guess.
Any additional comments? Or no?
Maybe just as an example, I mean, you talked about you need to find other sources of financing, and I mean, in Sweden, I mentioned that we have 3.6 billions allocated to this, and that would only probably give us about 2 million of negative emissions, and we would need 10 just for Sweden. So it's quite a lot of money to do this, and we're gonna need to find a way to find that money. Also, I mean, circling a little bit back to what Oliver said about different countries, I mean, some, like Ireland, they have a lot of residual emissions, and I mean, the places where you could do this carbon dioxide removal is not evenly spread out geographically. And probably if we want to go to net negative emissions, it's going to be even more interesting to see, like, how are we going to distribute that burden, or who's going to pay for it globally. So that is just more like an open question, something that we need to address sooner or later.
Great, thanks. I think we have time for one final question here in the front.
Hi, Tigran Aslan from Indigo Agriculture. And thank you for this wonderful event. And Mathias, for me, following the EU policy very closely, I have to congratulate you on your overview on the framework. It really makes sense to me, and it was a good reminder. But my summing up question would be for Dr. Geden. I believe the private market has to play a role if it comes to finding the money to finance the transformation and CDR solutions. And the IPCC clear recommendation and call was for CDR solutions and LULUCF as a carbon-rich ecosystem. If you could summarize or prioritize your recommendations for policymakers to drive this high demand for carbon removals, what would be, from your view, the top 3 to-dos for policymakers, let's say in the EU, to drive that demand?
Well, here I have to combine the IPCC knowledge with what I would say as an expert on EU climate policy. I think the IPCC had that problem that there is not much literature on financing, incentivizing carbon dioxide removal that goes beyond, let's say, conceptual pieces. Simply because there are not that many empirical cases right now. Of course, you can look at it in forestry, but I think as well many of these at least initial applications can work with instruments you already have. So we need incentives, but I think we need to try out what works, and I think it will not be the first priority just to integrate carbon dioxide removal in the standard carbon pricing schemes like we have in the European Union. So let's say I'm really looking forward when Sweden is introducing a reverse auctioning scheme. We will then see what we can learn from that. In other cases, direct regulation and simple obligations might make sense as well. So we have via the existing LULUCF regulation. Okay, we just have the numbers that member states have to deliver, whatever incentivizing scheme they use for it. But what we need targeted incentives, and then we will learn from their application. The long run problems, who's going to pay for it if we have low levels of residual emissions? Yeah, that's going to be interesting. Under net negative, even more interesting. But let's say it's a little bit academic right now. So I would simply go with quotas and regulations in the shorter term. I think the most crucial part might be monitoring, reporting, verification, and including then in the European Union what we now do via certification. I think is a very specific problem we will find out. We tend to talk about 3, 4, 5 methods, but even in the IPCC report that did not cover all the methods. We have bottom-up techno-economic assessments for 12 of them. And even in a huge administration like in the European Commission, it would be hard to say, well, now let's do a system that covers all these methods that could potentially be interesting. So then priorities need to be set and decisions need to be made there. And when we need to create a learning systems in the European Union, in member states around the world, because we will have to live with imperfection. They will not be optimal. There's still a lot of learning to do. And in some of the cases, we already know that now, let's say for soil carbon sequestration, we will have to rely on modeling. We will have to rely on remote sensing. It's gonna be tough to create transparent systems, but economic actors have to know what they can get, what they can account for under if they apply their practices. And at some point, the countries that are incentivizing carbon dioxide removal would want to have them accounted towards their national obligations, be it within the European Union or globally. So I think MRV certification. That's really crucial as a very first step, and there where it will become very technical and mistakes will be made, and we need system that can constantly improve. So I would even say we can learn from all the mistakes we made in the past and how to create systems where we then don't create path dependency under which we will suffer for 20 years or so. But I think in the overall debate, and maybe that's a third point, acknowledging, and that was what was tried by the IPCC report, get countries to acknowledge they have set net zero targets, and if they use the word net or neutrality, they already said yes to CDR. We should stop treating it like, is it a yes or no question? Do we really need CDR? Yes, and we are already doing it if we have forestry, and we need it if we have a net target. Whether we're going to need net negative emissions on a global level remains to be seen. For 1.5, we would surely need it, but also there we should recognize that the European Union already has that net negative vision in the climate law. Germany has it, I think Sweden and Finland have it as well. So we need to prepare for that future as well, and mainstream climate policymakers have to treat carbon dioxide removal options just as they treat let's say more conventional mitigation option like emissions reductions, and say, okay, there are certain things we like to see, so we incentivize them. There are certain risks we need to manage. There are things we don't like to see, so we just don't do it or prohibit others doing it. But I think we will see a normalization of carbon dioxide removal within the climate debate, and that's a good thing for the future. But which methods we use, yeah, we're along on which ones will be the most effective ones, in which region, in which sector, we simply need to find out. That's not, yeah, I think it's an implicit recommendation within the IPCC report, and we need front runners in this area.
Great, thanks, Oliver. Do any of the panelists have any concluding thoughts or reflections that you would like to share? No? Been talked thoroughly. So join me in an applaud for really interesting presentations. Thank you. And thank you to the audience as well.